All right. So that is the whole structure that we are going to be working with. And then the last file that I want to create within the root directory, so I just want to make sure that I am inside the root directory, is to create a README file. So I will call it README, and the extension is going to be Markdown file, or in short, it stands for MD. That essentially allows us to kind of create some notes, and that notes will be kind of publicly available when you push this project onto GitHub, such that if there are any other users who want to kind of look into your project, get an understanding of what this project is all about and stuff like that, they can kind of use your README file to follow the step-by-step instructions as to like, what are you doing, what this project is all about. So that is what we are going to be using this README file for. In order to create notes about our project. And then essentially when we push it, that information will be kind of available in the forefront on our GitHub repositories, right? So of course, there is some syntax and learning curve involved when it comes to working with Markdown files, but it is pretty straightforward, right? So even if you don't know it, what you can do is you can Google search basic syntaxes for a README Markdown file, and then you might get a lot of, you will get a lot of different reference sheets, which has all of the summarized syntaxes on how to work with Markdown files, right? So if you do not understand the syntaxes at this point of time, don't worry about it. It's just think about it in a way that it's a fancy notepad file that we are using, which has a certain structure that needs to be, or structure that needs to be followed in order to create that, right? So in order to create a heading, you will just say design notes for calculator app using JavaScript. Okay, and here we will just say not basic, but simple arithmetic calculator app using JS. Okay, so essentially, just to give you an idea, if you write it with this pound symbol, then that is basically the first or the biggest font size heading that you can specify in a Markdown files, right? So the things that we want to do is basically create like a bullet list. So essentially what you can do here is, if you want to do an unordered list, you can just simply do this. If you want an ordered list, then you can just put the numbers and then start writing about it and stuff like that. So what we want to first visualize is, how does a calculator's interface look like when it comes to working with it on a browser screen, right? So that is kind of important for us to basically understand. So if we look or do a very basic Google search with respect to the calculator app, so you can see that there is a lot of different options that are available to us. So for example, if we look at this one, there's a lot of different ways in which this interface can be implemented, right? So first we have to understand this layout, because this layout will inform what we need to write in our HTML file, and then what we, or how we need to present it through our CSS file. So those are the two important things that this layout information is going to help us with, right? The logic depends on what we are trying to implement, and that is something that we have to determine based on the calculator that we are trying to write here, right? But if you look at most of the interfaces and the layout, so for example, if you take a look at this is mostly for the native applications or smartphones, but you get the general idea that there is going to be some kind of display field to show the interactions to the user as well as the output to the user. And then the first row basically consists of all of the different functionalities and the operations that you are going to be supporting through your calculator. So for example, here, that functionality is kind of wrapping around this particular topmost row and then the last column here. So you have the clear option, which kind of clears up all of the input output area, display area. And then you have the basic arithmetic operations of divide, multiplication, subtraction, and addition. You have a backspace button. Sometimes you don't see this backspace buttons in some implementations. So we will figure out what we want to do with this. And then we have a equal to sign or an equal to operator, which essentially is a way to kind of get your output. So if you hit this button, then whatever the current state of the operation is, that will be displayed in the display area. The final output will be displayed. In addition to that, there is also a button, or there is also an input for your decimal value. So if you're handling basic decimal points, then that is there. And then finally, the last set is the numbers that is going to be present for our interface that ranges from 0 to 9. So that is the basic idea of a simple calculator, right? And now it is up to us to kind of, make that decision on how we want to implement this, right? So since we are not working with mobile screens as such, we have a little bit more real estate when it comes to kind of implementing this grid interface, which essentially what it is for our calculator. So what I mean by that is that instead of having to wrap our operators that we are going to be using for our logic around the number grid area, we can somehow, maybe not somehow, or we can choose to implement it side by side. So that means all of the operators being in one row, and then we can move on to the other numbers here, and then we can give the equal to sign in something like a similar fashion as you see it here on the screen, that it spans across two different rows. On the very last column, we can extend this and make it seem as if it spans across multiple rows and stuff like that. But you get the basic idea that what does a calculator layout on a web browser or on a native device kind of involves, what kind of different areas or what kind of different aspects do we need to be present here. So to write down or to summarize essentially what we have basically an input and output display area. Okay, so that is one of the aspects that we have in our design layout. We have all of the different operator buttons. Okay, operator buttons. Okay, in addition to all of the different operator buttons, so these buttons are basically to perform operations such as divide, multiply, subtraction, and then addition. In addition to that, we also have buttons or operators for equal to, that is going to give us the output itself. We have a button for decimal. Okay, in order to specify decimal point, we have another button here. So we need that decimal point button. And in addition to this, did we miss anything else? So we have the display area, we have the operators, we have the backspace button, and we have the all clear button. So all clear button is something that is universally going to be present. So we will say here that we need a all clear button as well. And we can call it AC, or you can call it C, whatever you want to call it, right? So that kind of intuitively expresses. So we're not going to do the percentage one here, at least for our operations, but once you understand the drift of how all of the different buttons are working, maybe you can try, or you should try actually implementing more functionalities to this calculator by yourself in order to kind of extend the practice from what just what I'm showing you, right? So this is what we want to implement. This also kind of informs our layout. So one thing that we have understood with respect to the layout is that the layout of all of these buttons that we need in point number 1 and 2, that layout is going to be in the form of a grid display. All right, so this is coming directly from CSS properties. All right, so we don't want to use Flexbox because essentially Flexbox auto arranges based on the available space that is there. So if you're trying to implement something like this on inside a web browser platform or a web system, right, you have to kind of restrict the div, which is going to be the container, and then implement it as a Flexbox, but you still cannot control 100% what is going to be or how the elements are going to span out, right? So since we can see here that the implementation of all of the different components for this particular application is in a tabular format, such as you can identify the different elements that are going to be present on your web page in the form of rows and columns, then it is much easier to implement that display property using the grid display rather than using any other properties. That doesn't mean that you cannot do it with any other properties, CSS display properties. You can, of course, but it is going to be a little bit more tedious than working with grid, right? So that is the layout that we want to work with, which is the grid layout. All right. So input output display area, grid layout, stuff like that, and all of these things are good, right? So that is basically the design notes that we need to take in order to get an understanding and start things off with, right? The other thing that we want to be mindful about is if you notice all of the different calculators here, right? There's, or if you take any other example, this one is not, this is a scientific one, but if you look at any different calculator example, you will notice there is a trend that you have the numbers starting from the highest numbers. So that means if you're going from 0 to 9, the calculator does not start off with 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That is not the iteration that it follows, right? Instead, there is a weird way in which the numbers are presented to us, okay? So that means it starts off with the last set of numbers, but it goes 7, 8, 9. And then it goes 4, 5, 6, and then it goes 1, 2, 3, and then you have 0, and then whatever other components that or elements that you want to place in the particular page, right? So if you think about it that way, then that means that when you're trying to write, so let me say here additional layout note, is that when you're trying to kind of like, design your HTML file, it is not going to be in the form of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, right? That is not how it will be going, but it will happen in a weird fashion. So that means you will have 7, 8, 9 first, and then you will have, if you see the example here, 4, 5, 6. So that means after 7, 8, 9, the numbers that you need to implement is 4, 5, 6, and so on, right? And before this, you will have to implement the display area that we talked about, that is going to show the ongoing input from the user, and then the resulting output for the operations that the user are essentially selecting. And then you will have your different operator buttons, and then you will have this number, but the design of the implementation of this number is going to be a little bit different compared to the other ways that we are familiar with, or the sequential way in which we would try to implement this, right? So let us get that out of the picture first. So that means we will start working with our HTML file. So I'm going to create a boiler template first, probably change the title. So calculator app demo, and just say winter 23. We'll put this. Then we will kind of link our CSS file. So here we will say CSS file. And then in order to do the CSS file, we will use the link element. And then we need to change this directory here because our file is basically within style.css. And after that, I will also link our JS file. Okay, so here, in order to do the JS file, we will use the script src, and the src is basically going to be within the JS subdirectory, app.js, and then I will also give another attribute as we had discussed before, which is defer, just to make sure that our script loads after our page loads, right? So that takes care of all of the initial setup with respect to linking different files that we are going to be using for our particular page. Okay, so now we can start working with all of the different aspects of implementation. So the way I want to implement this particularly is, first and foremost, let me open my trusty Paint. Okay, so what I want to do is note the fact of this layout, right? So we have to kind of identify our containers or wrappers, the div wrappers or containers that we are going to create around these different aspects. So what I want to do is I want to create one wrapper that will kind of wrap this entire calculator. And then I want to create another set of wrappers that will kind of wrap all of these different key elements or these different buttons that our calculator will have, right? And then essentially this display area that is going to show the input that the user, so when I press 8, this will show 8, and when I say plus, and then I give 5, it will show 5, and when I hit equal to, it will show 13. So this display area will be outside of the wrapper for all of the different buttons or the calculator keys, but will be inside the entire wrapper that will be present around the calculator. So again, to repeat, we will have one wrapper for the entire calculator, and then we will have one wrapper which will be around all of these keys. Okay, and the reason why we want to create another internal wrapper around all the keys is because when we want to kind of select all of these elements using JavaScript, this wrapper will help us grab all of the elements in one single go. Because if you remember our DOM structure, right, which is the hierarchical tree-like structure that is used to represent all web systems, right? If I select a parent element, okay, all of its child that is kind of rooted at that particular subtree will also be selected in one go. So instead of having to select all of these individual HTML elements from the page one by one using JavaScript syntax or JavaScript functionality, what I would do is I will wrap this whole thing here within a wrapper or within a div container, grab that entire div container into JavaScript, and then use JavaScript logic in order to kind of individually access all of these different child nodes that will be present inside of my div, right? So that is the way I want to implement it. When you're working with multiple, elements that you want to capture with JavaScript, it is just easier to get it out of the HTML and into your JavaScript logic, and then use JavaScript logic to do the individual manipulations rather than having JavaScript connect to each of these individual HTML elements one by one. Okay, so we will see how that works out for us. So what I want to do is first go to this body here, and then the first thing that we want to create is basically the wrapper or container for the entire calculator. So this is something that will stay around this whole thing, this border that you can see here. All right. So in order to create that, it's going to be pretty simple. So we are just going to say we want to create a div, okay, and then we will give it a class name, and that class name will be something like just the calculator itself, the entire calculator. All right. So this is done. And then inside of this, we can see that the first thing that we see within this wrapper, or the first aspects, so HTML is sequential in terms of its rendering, right? So we have to keep in mind what needs to be rendered first, next, and so on and so forth, right? We cannot just arbitrarily put all of the different HTML elements on our page and expect that to show up the way we want it to, right? So technically, what we have after the wrapper, the first element that is going to show up, the HTML element, is basically this input output display area. So since we are saying this again and again, right, that this is going to be an input output display area, so the way we want to implement it essentially within our HTML itself is by using the HTML tag or the HTML element for input, right? So let us give some documentation here, and let's say we call it calculator screen, which is going to display all our input and output. So this is going to be an input, and I want to do a type text because I'm going to be showing string values when it comes to rendering the information there. I want to give it a class name or basically an identifier. You can choose to give ID if you want to do it. So I will call it calculator dash screen, okay, in order to make it. The only difference that I want to make is that I'm going to use this additional attribute called value, okay, and I'm going to give it the attribute of disabled, okay. So that means there will be no initial value that will be present here, and I want to disable this. So essentially what I'm doing is, we all remember that input HTML elements allows the user to enter actual value. So if I say here input type email, so it is going to accept an email. If I say input type password, then it is going to accept a password and it's going to show it that way, right? So if I say input type text, so that means I'm creating an HTML element which will allow users to type text into that particular box that will be rendered on our page. But the only difference is that here in this particular implementation, this box is not supposed to be something that the users can interact with, right? So that means they are not going to provide their input within this text box, where they are going to provide the input by clicking on these different elements, which will be represented as HTML buttons on this interface, right? So that is how the user is going to provide or engage, provide input or engage with this particular interface. So that is the reason why, even though we have created this input box, which is going to display string type values, we have disabled that and set the initial value to empty. Okay, so this is basically the initial value that will be shown here, or that will be displayed here. And we have disabled that. So when you disable an input box, essentially the user cannot or is unable to kind of enter any kind of data into this particular field. So whatever you want to show it based on your logic, the way you're going to implement it, that is what will be displayed on the interface itself, right? So moving on, now that we have taken care of this input output setup, the next set is all of these different key elements or all of these different elements that we have on the calculator, right? So as we just discussed, we will have a wrapper for the entire calculator, and then we will have a wrapper for this key elements, so that when we are trying to extract or connect these HTML elements to our JavaScript code, we can just grab it by this entire wrapper that will be there around these keys, and then individually work on those keys within our JavaScript code, instead of trying to use JavaScript and connect to all of these keys one by one. Okay, so we will see what difference it makes when we actually go to JavaScript and implement that, right? So next thing that we want to do is basically create a container. We can say a div container. Just set this down a bit. Yeah, div container for calculator keys. So this is what we want to create. So going ahead, we'll just create a div, okay? And we need to give this a class as well in order to identify it, so that we can kind of connect to it. And then we'll give it something simple and identifiable, such as calculator dash keys, okay? So then once we have created this wrapper, what follows after that is basically all of the different buttons that is going to be present. So as we discussed, we have to write down or implement the buttons in HTML exactly in the order that we want it to be rendered on the page. Okay, we can of course use CSS to kind of manipulate the presentation and the aesthetics part of it, but the actual content, as I was telling you here in this note here, needs to be just the way that we want it. And the way we want it to be implemented is that the first row will be all our operators, right? So that means we will make it a little bit different from this, because this is a native interface itself. Since we have the space for a web browser, right, we will use probably this first row for all of the different operators. So that means we will do divide, multiply, blah, blah, blah. Then we'll do 7, 8, 9, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 0, and all of the rest of the stuff along with the equal to operator. Okay, so in order to do that, we need to make sure that we write it just like the way that we want it. Okay, so that means the first set of the first row is basically buttons. So HTML buttons for calculator operators. All right, so what we want to do here is first create a button. Okay, and this button, it has a type, right? Button has 3 different types. It could be the button itself, or it could be a submit button that is essentially used to submit an information of the form, if you remember that, or it could be a reset button in order to reset all of the information about the form field. Okay, since we are not working with a form here, okay, we are not submitting any data to the backend, the type of the button is going to remain as button itself. So it's basically a button. Okay, so we are going to set it as a button. Now we are going to give it some class names that will distinguish the keys from each other, because remember, the thing that we're talking about is that when we are going to link this particular HTML set of particular HTML elements to our JavaScript code, the first thing that we will be doing is using this container or this wrapper to grab all of the different child elements that will be present, right? But again, remember, if you want to implement a calculator, the way that these, okay, why is this behaving weird? The way that these different operators is going to work in terms of logic, or what that button will do if the user presses it, is going to be different from all of these number values, right? So I hope you understand this. So that means if a user presses multiply, or this symbol that is going to be shown in our interface, the logic of what your JavaScript code needs to do is different from when a user presses these numbers. Similarly, the logic is going to be different for our decimal point. The logic is going to be different for our all clear button, right? So all of these, if you notice here, the way it needs to behave belongs to different groupings. So that means all of these numbers will belong to a particular class identifier or particular grouping. The operators will belong to a particular grouping with respect to the functionality. Decimal point will be different, all clear button will be different, right? So when we create these class names here, we want to create it based on the grouping that it belongs to. So right now, the first thing or the first grouping that I want to create is basically the set of operators, right? And then I'm going to use the value attribute again. And remember, the value attribute essentially shows whatever value that you pass here when the interface first loads up. So that means the first, let's say if I want to give a plus sign here. So this is what will be displayed to the user by default when the web page loads essentially, right? And then what you want to show on the screen itself, or the value that is connected to it when you bring it up, this is the plus sign, and then this is what you are going to render up. So now once this is created, we can essentially do the rest of the 3 different arithmetic operation buttons. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it 3 more times. Okay, so the second one, let's say we have a subtraction, and then we have a division, okay, and then we have a multiplication. So this is what we can do, right? Or addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Okay, so multiplication and division. Now that it would have made any difference. So now here, in order to display this, we can do ampersand and then times. Okay, so that will show it as this cross product sign rather than this asterisk sign that we are essentially using. And similarly, we have another special character in order to show the divide. So if you want to show the divide in this particular way, instead of showing it as a slash sign, so that for that you can do ampersand and then divide. Okay, and then here we need to change this value. So this will become basic subtraction. So that is what you need to represent here. So remember, the value here is the value that will be associated to this particular button when it is grabbed or lashed onto by JavaScript. And whatever you write here is what will be shown on the web page when this particular page loads, right? So let us save this, and let us just save this as well, because we made some changes. This thing is doing weird stuff, but anyways, that's fine. So I will just open it with the live server. Wait for it to open up. Okay, so all right, so this is what we have right now. Okay, just a basic set. And here you can see that even I'm trying to click this area here, but nothing essentially is happening. And the reason why that is the case is because this area is essentially disabled and it is not allowing us to interact with it. These are the different buttons, as you can see, that we created. This is the cross product sign, and this is the divide symbol that we have. And then we are going to continue adding all of the different stuff into this particular operation. So I'm just going to leave this in minimized mode. Okay. Probably right here, and this is going to vanish away, but that's fine because we need to reduce this as well. All right, so once the buttons are done, the next thing that we want to do is basically, if we go back and look at our layout again, so we have the numbers here. So we want 7, 8, 9, then 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth, right? So in order to do that, we're just going to move forward, and here we're going to create another documentation, and then we will say number buttons for calculate. Okay, and the way we are going to do it is by the same fashion that we did here, is we're going to create a button. Okay, and the type of that button is going to be again a button itself. So we are going to say type button. Okay, we need to give it a value following the same way that we did for the previous one, and then we need to give the display value that will be shown on the page itself. So here this value will be 7. All right, so remember, again, this attribute value is what JavaScript will store when it is connected with this button element from your HTML page. And then what you write here is basically the information that is going to be displayed to the user when it will be rendered on a particular web browser, right? So I'm going to take this particular button element, and then I'm going to copy it 2 more times. Okay, and what I need is the next value to be 8, 9, and that's it, right? So that is basically the numbers for the topmost row that we have on our calculator. So basically this particular row. So we want to do this 2 more times at least until we change the drift of what we want to do. All right, so essentially what we want to do after this is the middle row. So I'm going to copy this whole bunch, give it some space, maybe give it some indentation. So we can say middle row buttons. And here we can say topmost row buttons. And this I will paste 3 more times. And the value here, if we go back and check what we need. So we have 7, 8, 9, and then we need to do 4, 5, 6. Again, don't be confused. What we are following is basically this layout of how the calculator needs to be implemented or typically shown to users, right? So that means here we will have 4, 5, and then 6. All right. And then we need to change this correspondingly as well. So this will become 4, this will become 5, and this will become 6 essentially, right? And then we need to do this one more time for a set of 3. So this will be the last set of buttons for numbers. Okay. So here, the last set of numbers that we have is basically 1, 2, and 3, right? So that means here we will kind of change this, make it 1, 2, 3, and do the same thing for the values as well. Make it 1, 2, and 3. All right. So the last thing that remains for us to implement is basically this number 0, this decimal point, this all clear thing that we need, this all clear button, and then an equal to button. Okay, I'm kind of skipping over the backspace, but I will still have the utility of the backspace embedded in another operation rather than an individual button itself, but we are not going to do the percentage symbol itself, right? So what we need is basically the last section, which will just say remaining buttons and other calculator utilities, utility buttons. Okay. So essentially that is what we need. So the first button or the first remaining button, remaining number button, that is what we want to say, is going to be the 0 button. So I'm going to copy this. That is going to be straightforward enough. So I'm going to put it here. So I'm just going to say 0. And then this value is going to be 0. So the remaining buttons that we have is basically a decimal, an all clear button, and then a button for our equal sign. Okay. So we're going to do copy this. Okay. We know that we need 3 more utilities here, but we have to separate the identification because these buttons are no longer number keys. These have a separate functionality that is associated with it. All right. So I'm going to first create the class names so that we can distinguish between what we want to do. So the first class that I'm going to create is basically for the decimal button, and I'm going to leave it as such. The second class that I want to create is basically for our all clear button. Okay. So equals and then this, and I will just say all clear. All right. So that is going to be our all clear button. Okay. And then kind of bring this in the same notation. And then finally, what we want is basically equal to sign. So remember, the equal to sign is still a part of our operator class, right? So it is one of the operators. So you have the multiplication, division, all of those stuff. But in addition to that, it is equal to is also a part of the operator because that is going to give us back the result. And that is something which has a similar functionality with respect to the plus sign, minus sign. So what I mean by that is, let's say if you do something like this, right? If you do 5 plus 6 in the running operation, it should show you 11. So after this, if you press, let's say another plus, so this will become 11. And then you can give the new, and then if you press plus again, this will become 13. So you can see that the functionality of the addition operation is not just to indicate the fact that you are adding numbers, but it is also performing the ongoing operations, the results, the temporary results that you need. But if after this, if you press 2, but instead of pressing another plus sign, minus sign, or whatever, if you press the equal to sign, then all of this kind of goes away from the display screen. And what are you left with is just the final number, right? So what I'm trying to indicate here is that in terms of functionality, in terms of logic, right, the implementation logic, we can group this equal to operator in the same stride as the rest of the arithmetic operations, given that it does not implement any arithmetic functions as such, but essentially the end game or the end logic is going to be the same. So we are going to keep it in the same grouping as that of our operators. So that means this is going to be an operator as well. However, this also has a little bit of different functionality, so that it does not implement any specific arithmetic functionality, right? So I want to create another unique ID for this, so that if necessary, I can distinguish or make that distinction between the equal to operator versus all of the different arithmetic operators that I am working with. All right, so let's move backward now and change all of this. So the value that will be grabbed from here is basically the equal sign. And what I want to show on the page is also the equal sign itself. For the all clear value, what would be the value here? For the all clear, any idea? Anybody wants to make a contribution? What should we put as the value for the all clear button? Okay. So it's essentially going to be AC itself, because we are going to use string manipulations in order to understand what our value is, right? So this is going to be our decimal button. So that will be represented by a dot, okay, or a period sign, however you want to call it. And then it will be rendered as a period as well. All right. So let's save this. Okay. And let's see what our calculator app currently looks like. So let's see. So we have the input output display field, okay, which the user cannot manually interact with. That is something that is completely within our control. We have all of the different operators for our simple arithmetic operations. Then we have the different number keys, but in the order that we would like to display them, or typically how a calculator looks like. Then we have the decimal, we have the all clear, and then we have the equal to operator, right? So that is essentially all that we need in order to work with our calculator, or basically to say or simplify it, that is what we need in our HTML file specifically when it comes to working with the calculator. So the next thing that we want to work with is essentially the styles.css file in order to make this calculator look or resemble something similar to what we see here. That is, we need to make it more presentable. All right. Everything here in terms of CSS will be something that we have already covered. The only new thing, as we have discussed, so we will say here, the new thing is display grid. Okay, so that is what we are going to be covering here. New concept to learn is display grid, right? Rest of the stuff is going to be pretty straightforward. So there is nothing new that is going to happen here, right? So I'm going to take the HTML file, all right, and then I'm going to reset some of the stylings and make it similar, or make it the way I want it to look like. So I'm going to take the font size and I'm going to give it a relative font size of 60% with respect to the width of the entire browser. Because remember, we don't want our calculator to span the entirety of the screen size on a desktop. We want it kind of, contained at the center of the screen itself, right? So we want to contain all of the different height and width options that is going to be happening around these options, okay? Also, we want to set the box sizing to border box. That is some of the basic stuff that we do when we set it. And maybe let me just double check so that this CSS is working. Let me just give some weird color just to do a sanity check and make sure that our CSS is actually connected. Okay, so this essentially works out. So this is working, so nothing is wrong here. Let me just see if I can do this. All right, let's work with this. Let's remove this project explorer, and this looks better, right? So we don't need this essentially. All right, so we can keep this white, and everything else here, we can kind of set this up and then continue working with the rest of the stuff. All right, so what we need to do is essentially want to implement some of the rules that we have seen when we work with Tailwind CSS. That is what is going to happen with respect to all of the different elements when we want to apply some styling rules before and after using pseudo classes and stuff like that. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to select all of the elements. separated by a comma, and then specify what happens in terms of pseudo classes before and after operations. So I'm going to take all of the elements again, and I'm going to specify the syntax for pseudo elements itself. And I'm going to first select before aspect. And then the second thing, I'm going to do the same thing again, not hashtag, but star. And I'm going to select the after aspect of how this behavior needs to work. Okay. What I'm going to do is basically reset all of the different browser CSS properties that can be shown here. So I'm going to set the margin to 0. Okay. And after that, I'm going to set the padding to 0. Okay. So what I'm doing here is basically resetting all of the default browser styles that could be present when a user opens this using different browsers. Okay, that's all we are doing here, nothing too crazy. All right, and then instead of writing border box again, since we had written border box here for our entire HTML file, so what I'm going to just simply say is inherit the properties that is there for this stuff, right? So once we do that, you can see here whatever padding margin that was previously present, whatever styling that you saw for the buttons, right, kind of got reset, right? So now we are free to kind of implement our own styling and stuff like that, right? So the next thing that we want to do is basically center our interface to the middle of the screen, right? So that is what we want to essentially achieve here. So what is our interface, or where exactly is our interface? So if you pay attention here, the entire calculator is wrapped by this container here, right? This wrapper or this container, whatever you want to call it. So that class is basically the calculator class. So I want to take this entire wrapper and I want to center that here somewhere in the middle of the screen, right? So in order to do that, I'm going to use not div, because there is 2 divs. So we need to make distinction between which div we are working with. And then I'm going to use the CSS syntax for selecting a particular class, which is dot calculator. And then I'm going to apply certain stylings to it. And these are the stylings that you guys have already seen. This is just a technique to kind of center the calculator app, right? So I'm going to first set the border. Okay, so as you can see here, there is this border here, which is kind of rounded a little bit, and it has a solid border that you can see here, and then it has certain color and stuff like that. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to use the shorthand notation. So I'm going to have a border whose thickness is going to be 1 pixel. It is going to be of solid type, so I can see it and it will not be dashed and stuff like that. And then give it whatever color that you want. So I'm going to use the hexadecimal code, and then I'm going to use a color, which is a variation of white. Okay. You guys can change it, play around with it a little bit, and make it your own. All right. Then I want to curve it around the edges. So I'm going to use border radius, and then I'm going to specify a value here. So let's say we want to start with something more moderate. Let's put it 5 pixel. The more you increase this value here, the more rounded or curved this edges is going to look like. Okay. And after that, we want to set the position to absolute. Okay, so that it does not move around or it does not move with respect to anything else. But keep in mind that there are also child nodes that is going to be present within this div container, right? So the way I'm setting this up is that eventually, if I need to anchor the rest of the child elements with respect to this particular div container, then I can use the position relative with respect to the parent for all the child nodes that is captured by this div container itself. So that is why I'm not using, display flex and all those things and stuff like that. So instead of using flex, align item center, space between, or whatever, the flex method of centering items on the screen, I'm using a different style of centering. So what I want to do is I'm going to take the distance from the top of the browser to be 50%. And then I'm going to take the distance from the left to be 50% as well. Okay, these are all relative units. Then I'm going to do transform. Remember, transform was a property that transforms the element, and the way it will be transformed is I will be translating it in a linear fashion by moving it 50% on the x-axis and then 50% on the y-axis itself, right? So if you do this, minus 50% will be here as well. Okay, and then I'm going to give it a total width I'm not going to say 100%. I'm just going to give some arbitrary value and see how it stands out. And I'm going to put it at 400 pixels. So now you can see that this is also another way in which you can center different elements on your screen as well. In addition to the flex method that we saw previously when we were doing CSS and we were looking into our navbar example, this is another way in which you can center it. So essentially what you need is from lines 19 to lines 22 in order to kind of center anything on your page, right? So that will be kind of anchored here at the center of the page, and then it will set up. So now you can see that this is the container that we are working with. All right. So we need to give it some more styling around this area in order to make it look a little bit more presentable and stuff like that. So the next element that we have on our HTML page is after this div container, we basically have this calculator screen. So we're just going to select this and start making it a little more user friendly. So here we can say style the calculator display screen. Okay. And this is identified by a class name of calculator screen itself. So notice here that this is the entirety of our div container. This is based on the width 400 pixel that we have specified in this particular CSS file, right? So what we want to do first and foremost is, if you notice here in the styling that we were doing, is that it kind of spans the input screen or the input display that is there, kind of spans across the entirety of the div container. Of course, you can give some padding here to separate the display from the sides, okay? But instead of doing that, we are going to span it across the entirety of this available space within this div container itself, right? So when we want to do something like that, we are simply going to say that use the width of 100%, right? So that means whatever width is available within the space that this element is present, it will kind of span across the whole thing, right? So after that basic stuff, you can specify some font size, and I'm going to use a different relative unit here. So I'm just going to say 5 rem. And then you can specify some height here, and I can say give it 80 pixels. These numbers are just random based on trial and error. These are nothing specific to what we are doing here. So I'm not going to give it any border here. So I'm going to set border to none. Okay. And then give it some background color if you wish to. So I will continue using the hexadecimal way. And let's say we give it some variation of black. So I'm just going to do 252525, something like this. The text color, since the background color is black, we are just going to use a white text color. So maybe instead of doing the same color as this background, we can just give completely white in order to kind of make it pop out. Text alignment is how you want to show the text. Remember, the calculator screen does not show the text to the left. It does not show it to the center, but the way it shows it is to the right, right? So with this example that we're using, it is always aligned to the right of this display screen that is present here. So that is what we are doing by specifying the text alignment to be right itself. All right. So once that is done, we can give it some padding, okay, around the right and the left, just as it is done here. So there is some padding here to the left. There is some padding here to the right. So essentially, we want to implement that padding left and right. So I'm going to set up a padding probably left, and then set it to, let's say, 10 pixel. And then I'm going to give a padding to the right, and probably I'm going to set it to 20 pixels and stuff like that, right? So now this looks more like a presentable display screen. And of course, all this button requires some love as well, in order to make sure that they are not doing anything weird and stuff like that, or they look more, aesthetically appealing to the eyes and stuff like that, right? So what we want to do next is basically apply some styling to buttons. Okay. So essentially, when we say buttons, we are going to move on to basically the next set of elements that we have here, which after this calculator screen is basically all our different buttons. Okay. So now the reason why I'm not making a distinction between operators and these different number keys is because they're all buttons. So that is why I'm saying that we want to apply the styling to the buttons, because if you notice here in the display, it doesn't matter as far as CSS is concerned, whether this button is a logic button, that is, it's going to implement a logic, or it is a plain input button where the user is going to provide an input with respect to the number itself, right? So what I'm going to do here is basically a little bit of a lot of stuff in order to make it look a little bit more presentable. So the basic stuff that I'm going to be doing is I'll just copy paste this instead of typing this out one by one and explain you all what I did. All right. So I'm going to take all my buttons. All right. So since this is a direct selection of an HTML element itself, so I don't have any group or ID itself. And what I want to implement here is basically the height of the button. So that kind of changes. I gave a background color of white, of grayish white of all of these different buttons. I gave it a border radius. So that is the reason why these buttons are a little bit curved at the edges. It has a border of 1 pixel of thickness, which is solid in nature. And then it has a color. The border itself has a color itself. The background color is transparent for just this button itself. There is a font size. There is a font weight. That is how popping it is going to look like. The text color that is going to be present for this button, so you can change it. Now, in a background image, I'm using this prototype function from CSS that is known as linear gradient. That is also something new for us here. And the syntax, the way it happens is the gradient color starts from a specific color and moves in a particular direction and changes that color. So the syntax is essentially, first of all, you need to call the prototype method, right, which is linear dash gradient, and then you have the first brackets. Within that, you first specify which direction the gradient is going to. So basically here I'm saying it is going from top to bottom. So it's moving towards bottom, and then it is going to start with transparent, and then the transparency is going to become 50%. And then this is the opacity that I'm using here, right? So remember, if you're using RGBA, red, green, blue, and then the A stands for alpha transparency. That is how opaque a certain element is going to appear. So the more the value that you give, the more transparent that is going to appear on the web page, right? And this value here, the first three values ranges from 0 to 255, right? So if you give 0, essentially that is basically, it's not going to show you any value. It's going to be within the black area of the color palette. But if you give the value of alpha transparency, that value only varies from 0 to 1, right? So if you put 1, it is completely transparent. So essentially you cannot see much of it. And if it is 0 value, then it is completely opaque. So this is going to be completely visible. So I choose a value that is in between 0 to 1, right? So here I specify 0.4. So what this whole code is doing here is I'm not putting an image here. Remember, you can give a URL and you can add an image if you would like to, that will act as the background image for all of these different buttons. But instead of image, we can call the linear gradient function and we can apply a separate set of colors. So what I'm doing is that the gradient is moving from top to bottom. The transparency is kind of reducing as we move from top to bottom, and the rest of the stuff remains the same. Here, if you provide a different color area, then color palette, then you can see that the linear gradient will start to change here. So there's a very strong tool in order to add very simple but strong styling rules to your web page. So play around with these values and see how it changes. Check out the syntax on MDM documentation and see how well it can do. All right. In addition to that, I'm also applying some shadow, and this is just an extended code of what the shadow is going to be on all of the different edges. So remember, for any button, if you see it, it is like a box, right? So it has a top, right, bottom, and left corner. So each of these individual lines, which is separated by a comma, is specifying how much shadow thickness is going to be present on each of these sides, and what is going to be the color of those shadow, and what is going to be the alpha transparency value of the shadows itself, right? Similarly, I also give a shadow for my text itself and not just for my entire box. And I do the same syntax. That is, I specify the thickness of the shadow and what color of the shadow is going to be there for our text and stuff like that. All right. In addition to that, since we have removed and reset all of our previous or all of our behaviors for our pseudo classes, we essentially need to kind of put that back again. So the next thing that we want to do is basically add a pseudo class behavior for our button elements. So all we are going to do here is nothing complicated, is that we're just going to change the background color to something that looks a little bit different from what we have presently given it there. So I'm just going to give it a different variation of the white that we have. So if we save that, now we can see that it becomes a darker color of gray in order to work with it. All right. So other than that, we want to change the color of our operators now. So we want to create that distinction between the regular buttons and the buttons which has some sort of logic that is associated with it, right? So here, you can notice that the different classes of buttons, our operator is there. Then we have one for decimal, and then we have one for our all clear button. So the next step is to basically apply the styling for all of these different buttons, or all of these different classes of buttons. Okay, so we're going to start off with our operator class. So operator. Okay, and simply what we are going to do is we are going to change the text color of that particular operator to something other than what the regular buttons are using, right? So I'm just going to use some value that I came up with. So I'm just going to put that here. So now you can notice that the buttons have a different color, and then the operator groupings, which is indicative of logic, has a different color, right? So that is a little distinction that I want to make. Okay. Then we also need to make a distinction for our all clear button, maybe a decimal button or not. We will come to that. So the all clear button is identified by this class here. So we're going to select this, come to our styles.css, dot paste. So what we want to do to the all clear button is basically do the same thing as we did for the buttons, which has some kind of functionality that is associated with it, is essentially change the background color, and then maybe add some aesthetics that is going to create a distinction between or how it is going to appear on the screen, right? So I will change the background color to something different. So F0595F. So it's just going to be a different color here. So that kind of brings out the utility of the all clear button. Okay, and then I'm going to give it probably a border color. Okay, so I'm going to provide it with a border color, and the border color is going to be, again, just to get into the habit of like using a color code, which is not just writing out the name of the color. That is what we're just trying to achieve here by using all of these different hexadecimal codes, right? So essentially, when you work with it, what you can do is just start with a color palette. Okay, any color palette that you know. It could be even white, right? So you can simply just do the white color. But then when you go here, this will give you all of the color palette, and then you can move this around to find whatever color palette that you want to work with, right? So that is something that you have to keep in mind, right? So now let's change the text color itself and put it here. So remember, the things that we are learning here is that the hexadecimal code can be of 6-digit or it can be of 3-digit itself, depending on how you code it, right? The next thing that we want to do is we want to change the behavior of how this equal sign works when you hover over it, and make it a little bit different in terms of making a distinction that the logic of the equal to button is a tad bit different than the logic of the first 4 operators that we have here. Okay, so after that, what we want to do is basically pick up that equal sign. So remember, now this is the reason why we had created a ID here in addition to the class, because the class of equal sign belongs to the same grouping as the rest of the operators that we have in this particular interface. But since we want to apply some distinction of this equal sign with respect to the rest of the operators that we have, we want to create a different kind of behavior to be present here. So what we are going to do is nothing too complicated. We're just going to apply a different set of background color, border color, and color, just as we did for the all clear button, so that, you know, we can identify the fact that the equal sign is a little bit different when it comes to the rest of the operators that is involved here, right? So you can also give a little bit of a hover effect, which is a little bit different with respect to the sign, equal to sign itself. So when you go here, that kind of gives it the same shade of, or same color palette, maybe a little bit of lighter tone or background color with respect to what this color is. So right, we are just changing this to like a darker shade of teal or whatever this color essentially is, right? So that kind of takes care of all of the different stuff. Now comes the major portion, is basically taking care of layout of the entire calculator. Not entire calculator, or basically the keys of the calculator. Okay, and this is what we are going to do using display. Okay, our display property of grid for the grid button. So notice the fact that we had created here a wrapper for the entirety of our calculator keys. So that makes our life a little bit easier, because now we are going to kind of position all of these child nodes, which are present within this particular parent node, in a tabular fashion. Okay, so we're not going to use tables for that. You might see some code that essentially does that, but we are going to use the proper CSS syntax. So we're going to select that class container, okay, which is the entirety of our calculator grid. And the first thing that you want to do is set the display property to grid. Okay, just as you did for display flex, you essentially want to set up display grid. That is what you want to start off with when you're working with the display grid, right? Declare it the fact that you're using grid. The next thing that you want to do is set up how many rows you have and how many columns you have, and then what is going to be the gap between each column, and padding and all those stuff, as we know from the CSS box model, you're going to specify. So the only thing that you need in order to set up the grid is to specify how many columns you have and how many rows you have for each of those columns, right? So that means, if you notice here, this example that we're looking at, so if you declare this whole thing as a grid display, you have to declare how many columns you have. So that means I have here 4 columns, right? And each of these 4 columns will span across all of these different rows that we are going to be using it, right? So we're going to use a shorthand notation that makes our life easier. We don't have to write too much of code when it comes to declaring the grid display. So what we want to do is use this property that is known as grid template columns. So I'm going to write it down here. So this is the one, grid template columns. And what we want to say is that repeat the following code inside it. So create 4 columns, and each of them will take up a row for the entire space that is available. All right. And this will give us something like this, right? Just this one single line of code. So what did we do here? We first set up. So if we give some documentation here, declare display property as grid. Okay, so that is what the first thing is doing. The second line of code, what it is doing is, well, sorry. Okay, declare columns for the grid. Okay, and this repeat method that we see here is basically taking whatever code that you pass here to the repeat method, and it is doing it for all of them, right? So that means it is doing it 4 times, and it is creating 1 row for each of the columns that you have declared, and it is doing it 4 times, right? It's repeating that process. So essentially, this is why we have 1, 2, 3, 4 rows, and then it is kind of taking up the entire space of whatever columns that you have declared within that, and it is auto arranging that within that columns itself. Okay, so that is what it is essentially implementing, right? So essentially here, oh, not to string it out. So what we have done here, so I will just put it after this, the documentation, so that whoever is watching can kind of understand it, what we have. So we have basically defined 4 columns, okay, with each column taking 1 part of the available space of the grid width. Right? So I hope everybody understands what we did there. The 4 is basically declaring 4 columns. So that is why we have these 4 columns here. And then each of them is taking one part of the available grid width that is there. So you note the fact that this container is the available space. Remember that there is a container, the calculator keys div container, which is kind of wrapping all of these keys that is present here, right? So when you say one FR, so that means it is taking one fractional space of the available space, and then it is creating 4 columns out of that. So the 4 creates this 4, and then the 1 FR creates that each column is going to take one equal part of the available width space that is present within that area, right? So that is the whole idea that you want to put. So the next thing that you want to do is basically give some, space. You can see that the buttons are basically collapsed on each other. So after this, if you want to give some spacing between the elements of the individual grid display, what you want to do is use the property grid dash gap. Okay. And then you want to set that to essentially whatever value that you want to put. And then you can give some box model properties to it. So let's say if I want to give some padding in order to create some spaces around them, then you can do that. And then this will give us a little bit more cleaner look with respect to how it is going to look. So here I can give another documentation code, and I can say put some gap padding between the buttons. Okay. So that kind of takes care of this sign. Now, the only thing that is problematic right now with respect to our layout is we need to redesign the equal to operator. Right. So if you notice here, this equal to operator seems out of place. It's not functionally that is something that is going to impact you as such, right? So that means if I keep it here, it's still okay, right? I can implement the logic of this program using the JavaScript code. But if you want to make it look a little bit more appealing, right? So if you go back and look here, you can see that the equal to sign kind of spans across multiple rows in a given column. So two things that is happening here is that we have to move the equal sign, which is currently for us in this location, to probably the last column. And then we have to kind of span this entire equal to sign across multiple rows, right? So for us, it could be a little bit different. It doesn't need to look exactly as it is. So the way we want to do it is by selecting this particular element and then specifying what is its starting row position and what is its ending row position in order to make it span across multiple rows. And then we are going to say that use the entirety of the height, that is height 100%, that is available for this. So for example, here, let's say if you wanted to span this, then I would say the property of grid row start is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's going to start at probably at the beginning of the 4th row, and then it's going to end at the end of the 5th row. Right? So that is the last row that is present here. That is what we are going to be specifying. And then I will say use the height of 100%. So it will span across all of this entirety of the rows, right? So similarly, if we go back and take a look at our code, right? And try to kind of reason with this again. Let's say I want to make this equal to sign span from this particular row till whatever space is available. Right. So right now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the last row is basically the 6th row where it ends here. Right. So if you want to do this, then we have to say that the starting position of this particular element is the 2nd row in the grid. And the ending position is basically the very last row of the grid, which is the 6th row, which is the last row, which we cannot see here. Right. And then I will say that take the entirety of the height that is available here. All right. So that is what we want to do. So in order to do that, we need to individually select our equal to sign first, right? So that is why we already have our hashtag, not hashtag, but pound equal sign, okay? And then we need to specify the starting position, right? So here I'm going to say grid dash row dash start. Here we can see. So I'm going to say it is going to start from the 2nd row, and it is going to span across grid dash row dash end, and it's going to span till the very end, which is the 6th row. You can set it to auto, but then it will take everything, right? It doesn't allow you to control it. So this allows you to span across 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, right? 4 rows essentially. And then I'm going to say that take the entirety of the height that will be available, right? So now you can see that this is what the outcome is, right? It spans from the second row to whatever end row that is available. And then it's kind of fills that entire space by using this height equals to 100%, right? You can leave it as such, right? But what if, let's say, you want to move this equal sign that you have here to this side? So basically you want to do like a swap between this row here and this row here, such that this equal signs moves here and it is kind of aligned with the way that this interface is kind of structured to a certain degree, right? So that is the last piece of operation that we want to learn when it comes to working with the grid display, is how to switch columns, right? How to move columns here and there, right? So it's going to be the same process. Instead of saying that grid rows start at 2 and then grid row ends at 6, we are going to specify for this particular button what is the grid column start and what is the grid column end. Okay, so that is the only process that we are going to be doing here. So I'm going to do this a little bit separately, although we can put it here itself. So what we want to say here, just to kind of show the implications of this, we want to start with grid dash, instead of row, this time we are going to say column start. And remember, the start of the column is basically the last column, which is visible, right? So that is the 4th column. And if there is something after that, that is going to be the 5th column, right? So we're going to say grid dash start, grid column dash end, and we are going to specify the 5th column. So anything after that, so it's going to essentially take the last column, and this will allow you to kind of switch the whole thing. Okay, so this is basically the grid display property and how to work with the grid display property. So just to quickly recap as to what we learned with respect to the grid display, is that whenever you want to set something up within the grid display, the first thing that you have to do is basically declare the display as grid, just as we do for Flexbox, block display, inline display, and things like that, right? The next thing that we want to do is we want to set up the columns. We want to declare the columns itself. Don't worry about the rows. It will auto arrange whatever content is there based on the rows, like how many rows you need. You don't have to technically worry about that. So you declare the columns. That is the main thing with respect to the layout. You specify how many columns you need and how much space each column is going to take up based on the available space that is there in that particular canvas, right? So here we are saying that create 4 columns and each column takes 1 fractional row space, right? Or 1 fractional unit. So that is why we have 4 columns and it is equally distributed across the different spaces that we have, okay? After that, anything that you put, like if you want to create a separation between these columns that you have created using this grid template columns, you can use grid graph to put some spacing. And then within this individual buttons, if you want to create some padding, you can essentially create those paddings and then it becomes a little bit more spaced out, right? So you can use all the box model properties here of margin and stuff like that in order to play around with how the display is going to look here, okay? After that, the 2 things that we learned in grid display is how to manipulate the display of an element within a particular grid and make it span across either multiple rows or swap its position in a particular column, right? Across columns. So if you want to kind of manipulate or span a particular element across multiple rows, then you use 2 properties. The first one is grid row start, which specifies the starting row position, and grid row end, which specifies the end position plus 1, okay? Then on top of that, if you give height equals to 100%, that allows that element to begin and end based on this position values that you have given, and then take up that entire space, that is fill up the entire space. Similarly, if you want to swap the position of an element in a particular CSS grid, then you use the grid column start, specify the starting column, and then you specify the end column plus 1, okay, in order to specify the end column. So here, the starting position was, we took that element from here and moved it to the last column. So the starting position is the 4th column. And then the ending position is end plus 1, that is 4 plus 1, that is basically the 5 area. Okay. So this essentially allows you to kind of declare all of the different grid areas. So one thing to keep in mind is that in some code, so I'll give you this tip here. In some code, instead of declaring these columns and rows separately, like we declare this row here separately, we declare these columns here first. That is the basic way of working with grid area, right? But however, there is also a property. So if I write it down here, I might find it, which is grid area. Okay, so the grid area is basically a shorthand notation of the entire grid structure, right? So what it allows you to do is specify 4 values. So if I do something like this, 1, 2, 3, and 4, this is how essentially the declaration of the notation is going to work. But what this indicates is that the first value is the starting row position of an element and the starting column position of an element. And then the ending 2 values are the ending row position of an element and the ending row column position of a given element. So instead of separating this into 4 values, that is, instead of saying grid row start, grid row end, and grid column start, grid column end, what you can do is simply use this shorthand notation property that is kind of abstracted within grid area, which is 4 values. The first 2 values is the row starting position, which is this. So if I combine all of these 4 values, it will look something like this. So it will be 2, 4, then 6, and then 5. All right. So I have combined the code in lines 101, 102, 107, 108 together into the single property 109, right? Where the first 2 values is basically lines 101 and 107. Okay, that is the starting for row and starting for column, and then ending for row and then ending for column. Okay, so essentially, this is how you can make these 4 lines of code even shorter if you would want to do so using the grid area. So that is something that you want to keep in mind, is how to work with grid areas and make your code base a little bit more cleaner, a little bit more smaller compared to the other stuff, right? So that takes care of our CSS and HTML. And then the only thing, not the only thing, but the main thing that remains at this point of time is to basically work with our JavaScript code, right? So in order to work with the JavaScript code, we will continue from the next class itself. All right. So that, and we will finish off the calculator app by the next class. All right. So I will wrap it up here, stop the sharing. And if you guys have any questions, I will take that at this point of time.